The media absolutely loves, a murder story. If it bleeds, it leads.
Welcome everyone to the Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues faced by businesses and individuals today. I'm Emily Bueno. I am a managing associate at Mishcon and I'm hosting today's event. Welcome, Hallie. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. Hallie, for those of you who you should all know, is a best-selling author, including of The Covent Garden Ladies and the Baillie Gifford Prize-winning The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. She's here today to speak about her latest book, A Social History, Story of a Murder, The Wives, the Mistress, and Dr Crippen. This is a fantastic book. It's a forensic analysis written with imagination and brio of the life and death of Cora Crippen, who was murdered by her husband, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, in 1910. Dr. Crippen was brought to justice by Cora's friends from the music hall Ladies Guild. I think the particular strengths of this book is its inversion of the true crime genre's glamorising of the killer and objectifying and often victim-blaming characterisation of the victim. Here, Cora's story and her humanity is at the forefront, and her objectification and vilification by her husband, his defence team at his trial for her murder, and the narrative constructed in the contemporary press reporting is challenged and unpacked. Hallie, there's no better person than you to speak about your book, so I'm going to try and keep stum from now. Are you able to give a slightly fuller summary of what you cover in your book?
Well, I think you've given a very good one. And what I've often said when I was writing this book and even when I finished it was, this is such a panoramic book that it's really hard to give it an elevator pitch. It kind of explores all sorts of corners. It turns over all sorts of stones. It looks at the society, the life and times in which a murder took place. But more importantly, I think it's important to say that I have come to true crime not as somebody who is necessarily interested in crime in itself, but as a historian. I'm a social historian, and what interests me so much about crime and criminality and acts of murder, deviance, vice, all of these things is what is recorded about them, because historians need troves of data sets, and we need contemporary reports, we need documents, we need all of these types of things to really understand a time period. And I found that wherever there was an incident, the amount of paperwork created around a crime was exceptional. But it allows you to kind of really drill into that time period. It's like it provides like both a core sample and a snapshot, and you get very, very personal accounts of how people see themselves and others, of how people are literally living their daily lives. They talk about their homes, their clothing, their possessions, their jobs, their food, their living circumstances, what they think of their world. And for me, that is what makes crime so interesting, because it's through that lens that you can really understand a society.
Yeah. And what led you to this particular story in the first place?
Well, I mean, I sort of came to this through Inspector Dew. So Inspector Dew has often positioned himself as the hero of this story. And Inspector Dew was the man who caught Crippen, as his memoirs are named. He literally wrote a memoir after retirement called I Caught Crippen. And because it was such a dramatic incident, this is, what he sort of built his reputation on. Well, I mean, he retired shortly afterwards, but he had also worked on the Ripper case. And so I had dipped into his memoirs when I was writing The Five. And I remember, well, what is this Crippen? Who is this? And I remember reading this case and going, God, this is just phenomenal. This is one of these, truth is weirder than fiction situations, where this man is telling this whole story about, well, his participation in it, but also, the strange things that happen, the Crippen and Ethel, his mistress, dressing as father and son and running away together, the the kind of the transatlanticness of this, that this is happening both on both continents. The fact that, you know, you have the press, the media at this time that reporting all of these things, and it felt so modern and it felt so of its time, and the turn of the century is such an exciting and fascinating period, and I was just drawn into it because of that.
Okay, well, actually, what I find interesting is the difference between now and then, and the reporting of the crime was obviously influenced by prevailing prejudices and norms. Are you able to expand on these? And I'd be interested to hear your view on how similar crimes now are reported and whether we've moved on from such reporting.
I don't think we have.
No.
I mean, one of the things that really surprises me still to this day is how it's often the murderer who will get the final word.
Yes.
You know, what happened, the murderer's explanation. The unfortunate thing is the victim is never, ever there to tell their side of the story. So it's really incumbent upon, you know, whoever is prosecuting the murderer to build a picture of what happened on behalf of the victim. And to make sure the stories of family and community and other people are integrated, which it isn't necessarily. But the media absolutely loves, you know, a murder story. If it bleeds, it leads. And so I'm trying to remember the name, and this is really unfortunate that I don't remember the name. This was about 5 years ago or so. There was this terrible case of this man who had murdered his girlfriend, I think, in Russia. And it was a horrific murder, and I think he had, again, very similarly, you know, kind of chopped up a body and put it in a suitcase and put it in a river in Russia. And a lot of the headlines that were running, I mean, not surprisingly, the Daily Mail, but I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but you know what I mean, you know, are still running these headlines. Well, what did she do? What did she do for him to have murdered? And it's, no, we're asking the wrong questions. It shouldn't be, what did she do? That shouldn't even factor into it, because nobody's done something which incurs somebody's wrath, and murder isn't justified. You know, I mean, no matter how angry you make somebody, you cannot justify murder.
Of course. And I think what's so good about and interesting about this story is that the Cora's friends from the Music Hall Guild challenged that at the time they were turning up at trial, and women who were dismissed were actually humanising Cora and showing her as the victim and challenging the defence narrative. And something we were just talking about outside, and I think it's really interesting, we're sitting in a room full of lawyers, is the, I would say the final 100 pages of your book is on legal process. Now, Hallie, you had a great spiel for me on this. Why the focus on the legal process?
Well, I think this is very interesting. First, I will make a confession here. My husband is a barrister, so that will have swayed my perspective and we did a lot of discussing of this during lockdown, where we were talking about justice and the process of justice. But I think it's very important to point out one of the things that has actually always annoyed me about crime stories, and whether that is detective stories or whether that is true crime, is that somehow, you know, it's all about the police officer. It's I caught Crippen. It's all about, well, we've caught the malefactor, we've caught the bad guy, therefore the story is over. But the story isn't over. The story isn't over until, you know, all of the evidence is gathered, and then that is pushed through this filter of justice. And that, you know, that is the process, the trial. Because it doesn't matter how good or how intrepid your detective inspector is, if they're not actually coming up with compelling evidence that a case can be built around, and a jury then finds this person guilty or acquits them, you know, that justice hasn't been done just because you've caught somebody who you think has done something. And I really wanted this story, I really wanted my readers to understand that all of this could come to nothing if they didn't produce the evidence, and how important that last part of the process is.
And I would add to that the importance of highlighting the details of Cora's life and what she was exposed to in her marriage with Dr. Crippen, because otherwise it's too much of a focus on the crime itself, which I think can almost glamorizing. It's there's importance in the banal of the everyday of leading up to why he did what he did and why she stayed and so on. I just want to take you back to, you were talking about this kind of wealth of material that's created with a crime. And I think one of the really interesting things that this book shows is there were the social mores of the time. So we've got the affair between Dr. Crippen and Ethel. And for those of you who haven't read it, I imagine none of you have read it because it hasn't been published yet, is Dr. Crippen and Ethel had this affair. It went on for years. And that was one of the motivations for him wanting to get rid of his wife. But there was this difference between, sort of sexual mores of the time and actually Ethel being quite open about this with certain people. So with her landlady, Emily Jackson, her sister. How did you find out about the difference between how people were actually living their lives and against how they were expected to live their lives?
Well, that's really interesting. Actually, that was the subject of my my thesis.
Sorry to take you back there. Sorry,
but that is literally the question that has drawn me to social history.
Okay,
because there is what people espouse. There is, I mean, we all have this kind of ideal of what life should be, and then there is the kind of rackety, uneven, strange way in which people actually live their lives, and which is full of hypocrisy and all sorts of other things. And I think that is actually a theme in this book, because it is really, certainly it is about middle class aspiration. Cora, or Belle, as I call her in the book, was born in a tenement in Brooklyn, and desperately wanted, the nice house, the nice clothes, the jewelry. And she married Crippen, who was a doctor. And Crippen felt, as a doctor, he should have all the trappings of wealth. And, they lived in a 10-room house in Holloway on Hilldrop Crescent. But Ethel also, felt as if she was entitled to that. She was born in a 2-room cottage in Diss, and her father moved them to Hampstead, and eventually they lived in social housing, and then they lived, then they were living in a rented house, and he worked in a dairy, but he saved up money to make sure all of his kids had like a clerical education, which meant they could move out of the working classes and into the middle classes. And so Ethel was just obsessed. She was hugely acquisitive, and I do believe she was the engine behind the murder as well.
I think that comes across, yes.
And she wanted that life. And at the same time, I don't know if anybody has read Diary of a Nobody about Charles Pooter, the Grossmith book, and this literally takes place in the same time frame and in the same area. And Mr. Pooter worries all about his sherry glasses and the right type of Christmas cards. And in the meantime, his house backs onto a railway line, and he doesn't use the main steps to his house. He uses the servants' entrance because the steps to his house are too fine. So there are all of these little social nuances and things that people are kind of, it's keeping up appearances and how important that is. So now I'm realizing I'm talking about the hypocrisies of people's lives. Remind me what the question was, because I've gone so off piece.
I was about to take you back there.
Okay.
So, I mean, it was about the discordancy between expectations and people's mores and actually how people live their lives, and how you discovered the difference between
those two things.
And in particular, how did you find the material? Because if you are breaking from social norms, I mean, I find it surprising that you would commit it to paper, which is what I imagine you found this
very
primary
reluctantly,
sources.
Because most of this material came from police reports and witness statements and trial transcripts. So it was obviously under duress that they're giving this. But the interesting thing, obviously, about these witness statements, and the statements given to the police, it's so, I mean, the lying, this is the stuff that just blew me away. And of course, my husband was like, yeah, of course they lie. This is my job. This
pays your mortgage, Hallie.
Yeah, it does. And so, there is the people who knew things and pretended they didn't know things, which then came out in other people's witness statements that they knew that person knew, and having to peel back layer after layer after layer of lies, which were all constructed in many cases to keep up appearances. Yeah. Exactly what I was talking about. Like, how long was Ethel dallying with Dr. Crippen, and everybody's kind of pulling a veil over that because, her parents knew about this, and it was deeply, deeply shameful when this came out, because nothing could be more of an indictment on the parents' morality than their ability to turn a blind eye.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to pick up what you're talking about before, which is the big feature of this book is social mobility. This seems to be a time of great kind of opportunity to move between the classes, and actually there's also between geographies. There is so much movement in your book. It starts in the States and we end up in London, and then we go to the continent, and there's an exciting race across the Atlantic back to Canada, and then also the movement up and down classes. And how much do you think that impacted on the story of the murder itself?
Well, in terms of what do you mean in terms of context, or in
terms of context? And I think, and you touched upon it before also, which was, for example, with Ethel, she was a woman who had started out life in Diss, in a 2-room cottage in Diss, and ends up living in Hilldrop Crescent as the next Mrs. Crippen. How do you think the ability to climb socially affected her role in the murder, and same with Harvey Crippen? I suppose he went down and then up again in terms of social mobility.
All are. I mean, this was what's so interesting about this time is this is a time of great possibility, and we were chatting about this beforehand, especially for women, this idea that women were entering, I mean, this was absolutely formative for women of the kind of upper working classes, lower middle classes, was the ability to work in clerical jobs.
Yes.
So you didn't have to be a domestic servant, which is what you would have been, a generation earlier, 2 generations earlier. You didn't even have to be a shop girl, which was a marginal improvement on that. You could actually go to somewhere like Pitman's and learn shorthand and learn how to answer telephones and learn double entry bookkeeping and learn foreign languages and all of these skills, which would then make you acceptable to work in an office, because business owners were learning, well, wait a minute, we can get women to do these jobs and we don't have to pay them as much. So they were hiring all of these women really from the 1880s onward, at the post office, banks, places like that. And this was amazing for women like Ethel, because with this little extra bit of education, and in state schools, by the 1890s, they were teaching shorthand in state schools to girls. Wow. So you didn't even need to do that. So, and according to the census, this really bears out in the census, 1891, there was something like 18,000 women in England and Wales working in clerical jobs. By 1901, that number had tripled.
Golly.
And then again, by 1911, it had, quadrupled. And so it's growing exponentially. But this gives people access to things they didn't have. And especially it gives women access to financial empowerment. Women could live by themselves. Ethel lived by herself with a landlady. They could afford to buy things. They could afford to aspire in ways that they couldn't before. And this is true even Ethel's father. Ethel's father knew that if he could get his daughter and his sons this type of education, they could move up through the social ladder.
And also, I would imagine it changes the dynamics of the marriage market because
Yes.
women were able to go in and meet men in the workspace.
And that was one of the real appeals of this, and it did happen. These I was going to say intra-office romances where, you end up marrying your boss. And that was, there were all sorts of novels about this. There was one that was written, I think, in the 1880s in the United States called Wired Love, which is about a telephone operator who meets a man who's answering the phone, and they have a romance, and then
sounds like a 1980s blockbuster.
Yeah, and then there was this, oh God, the names are fantastic of these novels. There was another one about like a lady typist, as they were called, who was called Estelle's Millionaire Lover. And she falls in love with a boss, and her boss turns out to be this evil criminal mastermind, and he takes her off on a ship somewhere. And it's just like...
sounds like this.
Yes,
exactly the same.
Exactly.
So Ethel, who was a typist who meets Dr. Crippen and ends up on a ship.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And there was one, and I'm sorry to take you back to the 5 because you're not here to talk about the 5.
I'll talk about the 5.
But it's on the table, so I can't help it. There's a really interesting paragraph in your book about how the anxieties of sort of permeating the reporting of this story of this murder in 1910 are somehow a development of people's anxieties about the Jack the Ripper, which happened, what, 22 years before?
Yeah.
Could you just unpack that a little bit?
Well, I think, the Ripper murders really kind of reverberated throughout society at that time. But a lot of the people who were impacted, I think, by this particular murder had lulled themselves into a sense of security because the Ripper murders were of women who were considered degenerate women, who were homeless women, basically, and who were at the bottom of the social ladder. And so women often comforted themselves by saying, well, that end isn't going to befall me because I'm not out on the streets at night. I'm a good woman. However, this story, when Belle Elmore's remains are found in the basement of Hilldrop Crescent, which is this beautiful tree-lined street, full of aspirational people. And it's so horrifying. And they realize, well, actually, first of all, what are the dark secrets that lurk beneath this aspirational middle class? And, where do we all come from? Because a lot of these people have just moved into the newly comfortable, and their background was, say, 20-odd years ago, similar to that of the 5. And there is that discomfort with that, that maybe it hasn't gone. But also, can you trust your neighbors? This veneer of respectability, it's just a veneer. It's not representative of a reality. And are any of us safe? And are any of us safe in a city, which is, this kind of molten boiling pot of vice and jeopardy?
Do you think the depiction of Belle, Cora, at the time as this sort of rapacious, she was called a slut, I believe.
God, she was called everything.
Do you think that was part of people trying to, and particularly women, trying to distance themselves from the Ripper murders, because to try and comfort themselves, to say, well, she was just like them. She was just like those, the canonical 5.
I don't think they drew a comparison that directly, but it was very much from that same ideological train of thought, which is that women are, Belle was a music hall performer. Yeah. What was said about her, now bearing in mind, so she was completely demonized. She was victim blamed for her murder. Throughout the 20th century, if you go on Wikipedia, it's pretty shocking what is still said about her.
Yeah, I looked this morning, yes.
And it is all derived from, this is important, really, really important to remember, it's all derived from Crippen's statement to the police in which he defended himself. And he blackened her character so badly that, because what he's creating a justification for not caring about the fact that his wife has disappeared because she was a horrible person. And then, of course, when he comes to trial, his defense are basically running sort of two strategies, which is he's innocent, but also he's innocent, but, you know, just seeding some doubt in the minds of the jury. She was a really bad woman and she deserved it, you know, and all of that was actually proven, not proven in court when all of the witnesses were cross-examined and nobody could come up with any examples of her being badly behaved. So, but all of this stuff stuck.
Yeah.
And it stuck so much that now there is a series of books called The Great British Trials, and they are edited by various people throughout the 20th century. And the person who wrote the trial summary for Crippen was a man called Alexander Bell Filson Young. And Filson Young was an appalling misogynist. I mean, you know, so this was written in 1920. And in his personal life, he treated women pretty appallingly. But he believed, from 1910, and he had written a letter to an editor at one point defending, or basically jumping on the press and saying, how dare you say terrible things about Crippen and Ethel's relationship? It should be respected no matter what. So he was always on team Crippen and Ethel. And so when he came to write the introductory essay to the trial transcripts, he was framing all of this like, well, you know, I mean, their love is noble, and Crippen was just a poor man who was put upon by his wife, and Ethel was this wilting violet and you know, completely blameless, and Belle was this horrible monster, you know, sexually deviant. There's no proof, by the way, that she ever had a sexual relationship with anybody other than her husband.
And she was accused of it.
So and she was accused of it. And she was, you know, terrible, unfaithful, shrewish, you know, avaricious, horrible woman. And she deserved to die because Crippen and Ethel's relationship was so pure and so beautiful that she had to be sacrificed. And that man's statement has become the gold standard for the entire trial, and for anything that has ever been written afterwards, they start with Filson Young and that statement.
Well, until now.
Until now.
Hallie.
Yeah.
Well, something I wanted to discuss actually was, and I'd hate to kind of focus on the gory details, but I think this is an important question, which is Dr. Crippen, his MO through his life seemed to me was just seeing people as objects. So he was a fraudster. He extorted or exploited people for money. He killed his first wife. I think you've shown he murdered her.
There's very strong suspicion that he did kill her.
Yeah, I mean, horrifyingly, I saw on the Wikipedia article this morning that she died from a stroke, age 30. Natural causes, eh?
That's what he said.
Yeah. With Belle, he had her ovaries removed. He didn't do it himself, and then subsequently murdered her and dismembered her. And also with Ethel, he removed 20 of her teeth.
Yeah.
And he just seized people around him as just sort of objects that he can play with.
Yes.
What I'm interested in your view is how much was he a product of his time, and how much was he just a sort of abnormal psychology? What's the difference?
I think it's both. And okay. I think anybody who, I mean, bear in mind, I'm not a criminologist. Anybody, I think, who is of abnormal psychology is also responding to influences of their time. We are all products of our time.
Sure. Yeah.
And we respond in that way. I mean, he was granted a lot of leeway, a lot of latitude to do things to women's bodies because he trained as, first of all, he trained as a gynecologist. I mean, could there be anything creepier than that? And he, you know, wanted to, it was very obvious he wanted to control strong women and he wanted to control women's bodies.
Yeah.
And that, you know, really was important to who he was as a person. I think he was probably, and again, I'm not a criminologist, so this is a caveat, I think he was probably a sociopath.
Right.
And I think Ethel was probably a psychopath.
So this is what I wanted to ask you about Ethel. She's an interesting character because she seems to want to present herself as this very demure, beta, so almost like a cipher for,
Yes.
for Dr. Crippen. But she, as you show, she's an agent throughout.
Oh, absolutely.
She's an operator.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about her a little bit more? Because she's such an important figure, and I think she's such an interesting foil to the kind of, I would say, the kind of good women in the story, which are the musical guild ladies.
Yeah, she is. I mean, what again is so interesting about this is that in turning Belle into a monster, it's like you had to have the flip side of that, which is Ethel, who was turned into by the media, by anybody telling this story subsequently, this poor quivering child. I mean, even her defense attorney, her defense barrister, Effie Smith, who basically got her completely acquitted of everything because he called her, you know, slightly hysterical. She was hysterical. But what Ethel was believed to have was the right type of hysteria, which was, there was a bad type of hysteria and there was an acceptable type of hysteria. And the acceptable type of hysteria was a woman who was so weak and so frail and so fragile and, you know, and she didn't eat and she had problems with her periods and she, you know, had headaches and she would cry a lot. And that's the right type of hysterical because it's very passive.
And you can control her that way.
And you can control her. But the wrong type of hysterical would be a woman somewhat like Belle, which was big and bold and hard to control, and, you know, with voracious sexual appetites and appetites for food and for pleasure and, you know, all sorts of things like that. And that was the wrong type of hysterical. So Ethel was the right type of hysterical. But Ethel also leaned into this and was instructed to do so. Ethel was, I mean, absolutely. So Crippen was a fraudster. He was a con artist. And Ethel, they worked as a team.
Yeah.
Even her father said she was his right-hand woman. She knew everything. They had their little, you know, the acts they would play when an angry client would accidentally turn up. And, you know, and she would play this game where she pretended she didn't know anything. She always deferred to him. Always. And so when the police came calling, she knew exactly what to do. And the way in which she handled the police, I mean, the confidence with which she tried to pull the wool over the eyes of Inspector Dew and Sergeant Mitchell was done with such expertise. You know, this was not somebody who was frightened by the law, was frightened by authorities. She was defiant.
Yeah.
And behaved that way throughout. And also, I mean, well, it's not absolutely confirmed. It's not confirmed because nobody ever pursued this, but she seems to have destroyed evidence when she was caught on the ship.
She threw something out the window,
She threw something out the window. She also was an absolute, like, I mean, her lies were as practiced as his. And she lied and she lied and she lied and she had zero remorse. And she lied to her parents and she lied to her sister and she lied to her friends and she had no remorse. I mean, she ran around in Belle's jewellery and clothing.
That's what extraordinarily striking was that very shortly after Belle's death, she's wearing Belle's prize brooch to a ball with Belle's and Dr. Crippen's friends.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's just incredible and completely unrepentant until the day she dies, and she never tells anybody. Her children never even knew who she was, and she died in 1967. You know, I mean, that isn't that long ago. And her children found out who she was because a criminologist had done some research and looked up what had happened and literally came calling and said, you know, your mother was Ethel Leneve. And what? And then realized...
An awful call to get.
And I know. And then they realized... And then, so I listened to the audio tapes of the interviews with the children in the 80s and 90s. And they didn't know who she was. And she kept this secret, you know, literally to the day she died.
Practice con artist herself.
Yeah.
And I think I'm particularly interested in, a particular feature of her audacity were the forfeiture proceedings after her, after Dr. Crippen's death. So, spoiler, Dr. Crippen was found guilty of murder and was hung, and he he made a will, and he left his estate to Ethel. And because Cora or Belle had died intestate, her estate went to him, and therefore it would then pass route through to Ethel. And she audaciously tried to get letters of administration of his estate to try and inherit bounty, I should say. And I should just plug for Mishcon. There's a very good article written about this by someone in my team. But anyway, I think that was a particularly interesting point, and actually shaped inheritance law and its influence even now. But yeah, the kind of the arrogance of it. It's really
incredible.
Yeah, you can say so. Now, I know that you've also got a background as a novelist. You've written some novels, and I think what I particularly enjoyed, and I wanted to ask you about, was your ability to inhabit actually people's minds, because there's only so much you can get from text, from primary sources. But what you seem to do is actually go one step further and think about what were people thinking. How do you do that?
By spending a lot of time, which I have over the course of my career, reading people's memoirs and diaries and letters, and getting a sense of how people perceived their world, how they saw themselves in the world. I mean, to me, that's the most interesting. It's the inner story, the inner dialogue that we all carry, you know, and how was, you know, a person thinking about themselves 100, 200, 300 years ago, and what did they think of the world that they inhabited? And to me, it's just completely fascinating. And if you imbibe enough of that, I think at least you can recreate it in fiction.
And how do you think people have changed over? So out of the period of history that you have specialised in, the last 300 or so years, how do you think people have changed over that time, or do you think we're all still the same, operating in a different context?
Well, I think that's more to the truth. I mean, I think that I can't even begin to tell you the amount of times people have said to me, as a historian, you know, like, oh, I mean, isn't it great? I mean, we're all just exactly the way we were 300, 400, 500. And the historian in me goes, no, actually, that is not the case. We are not the same. I mean, yes, we all feel kind of love and hate and disappointment and jealousy, and all of these human emotions are all still there. But how we kind of configure them and how we rationalize them, you know, our contexts for those emotions, for those experiences are very, very different. So, you know, one little example of that is when Ethel and her sister Nina were working for Crippen. They were teenage girls, by the way, you know, and he decided to pursue them. And today, that would be the way he behaved would be considered grooming.
Yeah.
And he would go to their house. He would come home from work with them and sit with their parents. And then he would turn up on a Sunday and be entertained and spend time with them. And her parents couldn't send him away because he paid them quite handsomely, and he was their boss. And yet he was showing a real interest in these girls, unmarried teenage girls. Now that, in the Edwardian era, in Victorian era, would not be considered grooming. There would be nothing wrong with that. But however, what would have been extremely wrong was the fact that he was married. A married man was courting two eligible young women, and that was the wrong thing. So you see how our contexts have changed for that. That, you know, these things, very subtly, you know, we look at things entirely differently now.
Yeah. And touching on the theme of that question, I think one of the striking and empowering features of this book is that Dr. Crippen is brought down by a group of women, essentially. He was... didn't the detective initially say, well, believe his story? And Belle's pals say, oh, hold on a sec, it's not stacking up here. And they did the forensic analysis, and they basically brought him down. Do you think it would have, if this murder had happened 100 years beforehand, that those women, that group of women would have been able to do that. They wouldn't have been music hall ladies, of course. They would have been, you know, if perhaps they were Covent Garden ladies.
I think they probably would have had even less agency, I mean, less ability to affect that sort of outcome.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, you know, I mean, they were complaining, well, you know, something seems wrong here. So, you know, she's disappeared and he keeps giving all of these kind of ridiculous excuses. She's gone to America, she's done this, she's done that, you know, and he kept changing it. And they knew something was wrong and they hired a detective to go and follow him around and follow Ethel around, and they did their own investigation. And they went to Scotland Yard several times, but Scotland Yard wouldn't listen to them because literally they were dismissed as being just bohemian ladies, you know. And well, what do you expect? These people have, you know, completely irregular lives anyway. You know, they're all jumping in and out of bed with each other. They have illegitimate children. You know, we can't, you know, God knows what they're getting upset about. It was only when one of these women's husbands, who they were close with the Crippens as well, said, look, I have a friend who works at, who's quite high up in Scotland Yard. We're going to go in together and we're going to see him. And they listened to the man.
Yeah.
They listened to the man.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until then that anything was actually done.
Yeah. Well, hopefully women would be listened to now. But I'm sure, and I'm sure as your husband will tell you, they're not always listened to. And
no.
There's not been that much progress.
No.
But, what is interesting, and as I was prepping for this talk, was there is this continuing interest in Dr. Crippen and his potential innocence. I know. Sorry, it's
no, it's awful. It's awful.
I mean, his remains were exhumed Bell's remains were exhumed recently and retested, and there was a question of actually whether those were a man and he was actually innocent. What's your take on this? Eye roll.
It's
big eye roll.
Big eye roll.
Yeah.
And just, you know, I'm just disgusted by all of it, because if you look at the background to this, first of all, this was for a documentary in 2007 called Executed in Error. You know, why do we feel the need to revisit? This was anybody who knows anything about this case, it was very cut and dried. You know, the evidence upon which he was convicted was very straightforward, you know, even for the time. I mean, it only took the jury about half an hour to come to a conclusion. And there were no shenanigans, there was nothing. And you know, they lost the appeal as well. Yep. So, you know, that was 2 rounds in the courts. So this was started by a man called John Trestrail, who's some poisons expert in the United States, who basically has been reading Filson Young and all the books, the pulpy true crime books written off the back of Filson Young, which called Bell, you know, a kind of peacocky slut, and Crippen, you know, this poor mild murderer. And he was, how could this man have done such a dastardly thing? You know, this is what comes from not examining true crime. It's this sort of belief, and this is, you know, playing out in the modern era. And so he said, well, you know, I'm a poisons expert. I've never seen overkill in a poisons case. Well, if you look at what a man called Ingleby Oddie, who was on the prosecution team and then later became a coroner, said he looked through all the papers, and then as a coroner he had, you know, ample evidence of looking at all this, and he wrote, look, this is so obviously a poisoning gone wrong. It's so obviously, you know, he tried to put her to sleep with hyoscine hydrobromide. He gave her too much, which it doesn't sedate you, it sends you into this kind of panic. And there was a struggle or something happened, and he couldn't pass the murder off as just, you know, she just died in her sleep. And so he suddenly had a body he had to get rid of. And that's why it wasn't overkill, it was having to dispose of a body he couldn't pass off as a natural death. So this guy was so determined on this that he found this lab at the University of Michigan, and they decided to test this skin sample, which was still at the, London Hospital collection. And bear in mind, completely everybody in the world had touched it, breathed on it, did everything. and it was only ever going to be a stunt. And lo and behold, they found it wasn't Cora's and it was a male's. And therefore, Crippen's innocent. Crippen's innocent. Not only is Crippen innocent, but terrible Belle, she was still alive, and they tried to find evidence that she was still alive.
She's living with Elvis in Australia.
Yeah, she's living, and Lord Lucan. And you know, Belle was still alive. And so therefore she didn't come forward to stop his execution. Therefore, Belle's the murderer.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where we've arrived at. And it's so offensive. And so I am friends with Professor Turi King, who is one of the people who led the team at the University of Leicester, who looked at the remains of Richard III and identified that. And so I had Turi look at the white paper that was written up. And this is in an appendix in my book. And Turi said, this is not conclusive. And the methods they used are unusual and not orthodox, and she said, by no means, you know, does this prove anything? And you know, the case is, well, I was going to say that the case is not closed. The case was always closed.
Yes.
The case is not worth, you know, overturning on that basis.
Yeah. And I suppose it's this interest in his innocence is just this general fascination in the true crime genre. And I touched on this in the introduction, which is this is an inversion of the true crime genre. But what's your take on people's on the genre? Why is it so popular?
I think there are a lot of reasons for this. I think people are fascinated with the deviant side of the human experience. I mean, the human mind, the dark side of humanity. I think women are drawn to it because there is this sort of thought that if you can identify who could kill you, you'll be safer.
Yeah.
And this idea that, like, the more you study and the more you know about perpetrators, the less likely you will be to actually find yourself in a compromising situation with somebody who's likely to kill you. Well, that's probably not true. But, you know, we sort of can't help ourselves, can we?
No, it's an enduring and popular genre. I'm very conscious that I have been grilling you for the last 50 minutes. There will be questions. If I turn to the room first, there's an orange microphone that's going to be circulating soon. Questions? Yes, orange microphone here, please.
Hi, Hallie. Thank you so much. So interesting. I first came to your work through the Covent Garden Ladies, and I think the thing that I found most fascinating about that was the fact that there were these stories that were being told about women in circumstances where we just generally get stories about men, and particularly when we're not talking about women at the very top of society. They're so almost unheard and unseen. And I was just wondering whether you can go even further back. At what point does it become impossible to tell stories about women at the sort of day-to-day life level?
I think you can go pretty far back. You know, there are records. I'm not a medievalist, but I have friends who are medievalists and are doing this work, and are able to do this work. I mean, there's a lot that's been written. You know, certainly classicists can do this as well. So, you know, there are ways. It's not impossible to retrieve the past. However, the further you go back, the more sparse the record becomes, and the fewer records there are. And so one of the things that I found, certainly, this was my first kind of foray into the early 20th century, and it was kind of overwhelming how much stuff I had, because, you know, I started in the 18th century, and it is sparse. There's enough there, but it's sparse. And then in the 19th century, there was so much more. And then suddenly with the 20th century, it's like, oh my God, what do I do with all this stuff? So yeah, I mean, to your point, it is possible, but there are limits the further you go back.
I was just wondering how you sort of see parallels in modern cases, and whether as a historian you find that disheartening to see maybe the changes that haven't been implemented, or whether you do see that there is a slow sort of positive upward trend, or if we're just repeating the mistakes of the past.
It's both. I mean, both, obviously. And also, the one thing I always say as a historian, and the one thing you learn, is that history is not linear. You know, we're all taught to believe, or maybe seduced into believing, that history is one long story of progress. And that's not the case at all. I mean, as we're seeing in the current age, dare I say, you know, people acquire and lose rights all the time. Nations rise and fall all the time. You know, certain aspects of our lives improve, certain aspects of our systems improve, and some people bear the brunt of the change. And so I think, you know, historically, I mean, things just, I mean, even what I just find so interesting just in the court case here is just how there were certain things that were done that I don't think would be done today. Like there was Crippen's defense team, there was this desire to kind of blacken Belle through kind of painting this nuanced picture of her as an immigrant, as somebody, a Slav. You know, so her family were Polish, Russian, even sort of dipping into anti-Semitism, even though they were Catholic, but trying to position their feelings about Belle in a way which were based solely on kind of ethnic/racial difference that could be seen, you know, as very prejudicial and really awful. You know, little things like that, you know, the misogyny baked into the attitudes. I would like to believe that that is gone from our courtrooms today. I would hope it is. I know from only just anecdotal from the barristers I know that...
Including your husband.
Including my husband, that there is certainly an effort to make sure, and nobody would try that on. It's so demeaning and horrible. Unless you have experience otherwise, I don't know.
No, I mean, I was just thinking though, I mean, certainly the lawyers in the courtroom can try and prevent that, but it doesn't, you don't know what's going on in the deliberations with the jury.
Yes, yeah.
And so that's when these kinds of attitudes can be filtered in, but we don't know because we are not allowed to film a jury. Yeah. So it'll remain a mystery. Oh, wonderul.
Hallie, I was just wondering if we're allowed to ask what your next project is.
Oh, I'm looking at I'm looking at Patsy, my publicist, and I knew she'd make a face. It's all a bit quiet. It's hush hush at the moment as things are germinating, but watch this space.
Excellent. Well, we're out of time, so no more questions. Hallie, thank you so much for coming in. For everyone in the room, you've all got a free copy. For people watching online, go buy yourself a copy. It's absolutely brilliant. And we've only really touched upon the surface today. And what a shame you're not here to get a self-signed copy anyway. So, thank you very much.
You're welcome.